Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Your host, Adam, here. Today I am going to talk about one of the most significant military campaigns of the 20th century, Operation Barbarossa. This was the code name given to the invasion of the Soviet Union by Nazi Germany in June 1941. It was a massive military undertaking that aimed to achieve strategic objectives on the Eastern Front. Despite early successes, the campaign ultimately failed, with devastating consequences for both Germany and the Soviet Union. The legacy of Operation Barbarossa remains a powerful reminder of the dangers of war and the human cost of military aggression. Operation Barbarossa was one of the most significant military campaigns of the 20th century. Launched by Nazi Germany in June 1941, the invasion of the Soviet Union was a massive military undertaking that aimed to achieve strategic objectives on the Eastern Front. Despite early successes, the campaign ultimately failed, with devastating consequences for both Germany and the Soviet Union. The legacy of Operation Barbarossa remains a powerful reminder of the dangers of war and the human cost of military aggression. Operation Barbarossa was the code name for the German invasion of the Soviet Union during World War II. The operation began on June 22, 1941, with a massive military campaign that involved over 3 million troops, 600,000 vehicles, and 750,000 horses. The campaign was intended to secure vital resources and Lebensraum, living space, for Germany, and to eliminate the Soviet Union as a geopolitical threat. The planning for Operation Barbarossa began in 1940, with the German High Command developing a comprehensive strategy for the invasion of the Soviet Union. The plan called for a rapid advance into Soviet territory, with the goal of capturing Moscow and other major cities within the first few months of the campaign. The invasion of the Soviet Union was a massive gamble for Nazi Germany. The country was already engaged in conflict with Great Britain and other Allied powers, and the diversion of resources and manpower to the Eastern Front would weaken Germany's ability to defend against the Allied powers. Despite these risks, Hitler and the Nazi leadership believed that the Soviet Union was vulnerable and that the German military was superior to the Soviet forces. They also believed that the capture of Soviet resources and territory would be essential to securing Germany's long-term strategic interests. The invasion of the Soviet Union began with a massive air and artillery bombardment of Soviet positions, followed by a ground assault along a broad front that stretched from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. The German forces encountered fierce resistance from Soviet troops, who fought with determination and bravery, despite being outnumbered and outgunned. The German forces made significant progress in the early weeks of the campaign, capturing hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers and destroying or capturing large amounts of military equipment and supplies. By July 1941, the Germans had advanced deep into Soviet territory, and they were within striking distance of Moscow, Leningrad, and other major Soviet cities. However, as the campaign progressed, the German forces faced increasing resistance from the Soviet military and civilian population. Soviet troops engaged in guerrilla warfare and sabotage behind German lines, and partisan groups attacked German supply lines and communication networks. The harsh conditions of the Russian winter also took a toll on the German forces, who were ill-prepared for the extreme cold and snow. The supply lines were stretched thin, and many soldiers suffered from frostbite and other cold-related injuries. As a result, the German advance stalled, and the Soviet Union was able to mount a counteroffensive that pushed the German forces back. Operation Barbarossa was a massive military campaign that had significant consequences for World War II and for the history of the 20th century. The invasion of the Soviet Union remains a stark reminder of the devastating human cost of war and the dangers of hubris and overconfidence in military planning. The failure of the campaign ultimately contributed to the defeat of Nazi Germany and the emergence of the United States and the Soviet Union as superpowers in the post-war world. As the winter of 1941-42 set in, the German forces found themselves bogged down in a brutal war of attrition against the Soviet Union. The harsh weather conditions, combined with stiff Soviet resistance, had taken a toll on the German army, and their supply lines were stretched to the breaking point. Despite these challenges, Hitler remained determined to achieve his strategic goals, and he ordered his troops to continue the fight. In the spring of 1942, the German forces launched a renewed offensive, hoping to break through the Soviet lines and capture Moscow. However, the Soviet Union had been preparing for this attack, and they were able to mount a fierce defense. The German forces suffered heavy casualties, and their advance stalled once again. By the summer of 1942, it was clear that Operation Barbarossa had failed to achieve its objectives. Despite early successes, the German forces had been unable to defeat the Soviet Union, and they were now facing a determined and well-prepared enemy. The war in the East had become a brutal and protracted conflict, with both sides suffering heavy losses. The failure of Operation Barbarossa had far-reaching consequences for World War II and for the history of the 20th century. The German defeat in the East meant that they were now fighting a two-front war, with the Allied powers pressing in from the West. The diversion of resources and manpower to the Eastern Front weakened Germany's ability to defend against the Allied powers, and it ultimately contributed to their defeat. The Soviet Union emerged from the war as a superpower, with a massive military and an expansive territory. The human cost of the war was staggering, with over 20 million Soviet citizens losing their lives in the conflict. The war also had a profound impact on the Soviet Union's political and social structure, leading to significant changes in the post-war era. The failure of Operation Barbarossa also had significant consequences for the Nazi regime and for the leadership of Adolf Hitler. The defeat in the East marked a turning point in the war, and it contributed to a growing sense of disillusionment among the German people. The high cost of the war, combined with the mounting casualties and the destruction of German cities, eroded support for the Nazi regime. Hitler's leadership also came under increasing scrutiny in the wake of the defeat in the East. Many within the Nazi Party questioned his strategic decisions and his judgment, and there were growing calls for his removal from power. Despite these challenges, Hitler remained determined to continue the war. He believed that Germany could still achieve victory, and he refused to consider any negotiated settlement with the Allied powers. This determination would have devastating consequences for Germany and for the rest of Europe. In the final years of the war, the Soviet Union launched a massive counteroffensive against the German forces, pushing them back across Eastern Europe and into Germany itself. The Soviet forces advanced with speed and determination, and they met with little resistance from the German army. The fall of Berlin in April 1945 marked the end of the war in Europe. The German army surrendered unconditionally, and the Allied powers celebrated their victory over Nazi Germany. However, the human cost of the war was staggering, with millions of lives lost and countless others irreparably damaged. The legacy of Operation Barbarossa remains a haunting reminder of the dangers of war and the consequences of military aggression. The invasion of the Soviet Union was a catastrophic failure that ultimately contributed to the defeat of Nazi Germany and the emergence of a new world order. It also left a lasting impact on the people and the nations that were affected by the war, shaping the course of history for decades to come. Conclusion: the failure of Operation Barbarossa was a turning point in World War II and in the history of the 20th century. The campaign was a massive undertaking that involved millions of soldiers and civilians, and it had far-reaching consequences for both Germany and the Soviet Union. The German defeat on the Eastern Front weakened their ability to fight a two-front war, and it ultimately contributed to their defeat by the Allied powers. The Soviet Union emerged from the war as a superpower, with a massive military and an expansive territory. The human cost of the war was staggering, with millions of lives lost and countless others irreparably damaged. The legacy of Operation Barbarossa remains a powerful reminder of the dangers of war and the human cost of military aggression. The invasion of the Soviet Union was a catastrophic failure that ultimately contributed to the defeat of Nazi Germany and the emergence of a new world order. The war had a profound impact on the people and the nations that were affected by it, shaping the course of history for decades to come. The lessons of Operation Barbarossa remain relevant today, as we continue to confront the challenges of war and conflict in our world. Thank you all for listening. If you enjoyed this presentation and want to see more, please consider subscribing to our channel and